It was back in 1998, and we were standing on a stage in an enormous auditorium in the largest conference center in the state capital of Michigan, and the place was buzzing. My wife had just given an extraordinary speech accepting the nomination to be Attorney General of the state of Michigan, and she and I were holding hands and holding the hands of our oldest kids in this peak moment. We turned. As I walked off the stage and down the steps, my sister had a funny look on her face as she handed me my 10-month-old son, Jack. Immediately, I knew why. The smell that wafted up from this guy was unbelievable. So I grabbed the diaper bag and threw the big black curtains at the back, and I looked for a bathroom. I walked and I walked and I walked, and I finally found one. I put the mat down on the floor and I open up, and it's everything I know it's going to be: consistency, color, and the smell. And Jack got happier by the minute, my beloved boy. And I found myself thinking, this was not the way I thought my life was going to turn out. I was a very ambitious kid. I wanted to be a political leader, and I read books about Caesar and Alexander the Great and FDR and JFK and Martin Luther King. I managed to get into Yale somehow, and after that spent 3 years of service in the South, and then got into Harvard Law School. Things were going swimmingly, and if they weren't good enough, I met the love of my life, Jennifer Granholm. Jen and I are meeting with Father McGinnis in preparation for marriage, and this prescient prophet looks at me and says, Dan, what happens in 8 or 10 years if the party comes to Jennifer? And they say, she's a Harvard Law grad. She's so bright, articulate, intelligent, caring. And there's a state Senate seat open. And by the way, it's a good time for a woman. He said, how would you feel? And Jennifer said, that could never happen. And I said, oh my God, I'm marrying my worst competition, the person I could never beat. Well, I told him I would probably be confused and maybe jealous, but I'd be behind her, and I was. And 4 years after that moment, when she gave that speech, you would have found me on the 70th floor, the tallest building, the Westin Hotel in downtown Detroit, jumping up and down like a 7-year-old at the exuberance that my wife has just been elected Michigan's first female governor. She's preparing a speech, of course. 4 years later, she gets reelected by a landslide. And after that, we crash. The Michigan economy crashes, the world economy crashes, and we're at the epicenter of it. What happens? Chrysler in bankruptcy, GM in bankruptcy, notifications every week to my wife that another company has moved to China or Mexico. And we get through it. I support her, she supports me, trying to be what used to be called a first lady. And we arrive in Berkeley. How great is that? Across the bay, ironically, from my wife's family now. And I take my career back off the shelf. I'm coaching CEOs and executive directors and other executives, and I have the wonder of teaching leadership to people like some of the students here in the business school, law school, and the School of Public Policy. I'm a bit schizophrenic as a thinker because on the one hand, I believe in the leader. My wife did amazing things as the leader, and so do great CEOs, and so did Father McGinnis as well. But on the other hand, I'd written a book called Everyday Leadership, and the whole point of that book is, sure, you can lead with power and authority, but you can also lead across to your peers, and you can even lead up into the bureaucracy or the establishment. I was a little crazy. I used to hand to my students at the end of the semester a water bottle. Here's Kenny Cromer. He sent me this picture from Machu Picchu in Peru. It says, kill the leader, L-I-T-E-R. So you can keep it on your desk and tell your boss, it's a hydration strategy. But you tell yourself, she's not the leader or he's not the leader. I can lead here too. And in fact, my two crazy ideas started to come together when I met another amazing priest, this one named Britta Priest. Britta came to office hours to talk about an independent project that she was working on, and her focal point was answering the question, how can I, who chose not to be president of my sorority, but vice president, lead as fully as I possibly can? And I said to her, Britta, go for it. I started to regale her with stories of important pairs and the powerful thing that a number two can do that a number one can't. My wife's chief of staff, my wife's campaign manager, a chair of a law firm, working with a CEO of a law firm. The examples were all over the place. I left that meeting and I was on fire thinking about these examples and how twos were everywhere in our organizations. Think about it. In journalism, who is the leader? The publisher or the editor? Think about the arts. In a play or a movie, who's the leader? The producer or the director? It's a crazy question. It's a trick question. It's both. Even in the Army, what we think of as the most hierarchical of organizations, sergeant and lieutenant work hand in hand, and COs and XOs all the way up the chain of the Army. Britta had really turned me on to something, and the biggest thing first was the blindness that we had, because this was our picture of leadership. I went back over a decade of Fortune magazine covers. I found almost 50 CEOs on the cover. And guess how many pairs? One. It's actually right there behind me. Look at poor Tim Cook. He doesn't even get his whole face on the page. I mean, come on. By the way, he's been CEO of Apple for the last 6.5 years. He's no slouch. Their partnership was critical. So I saw it everywhere. And I saw the ridiculousness of this kind of idea, I alone can fix it. Who alone can fix what? I knew I needed a partner. So I recruited a guy who had very different skills than me. His name was John Gillis, and John teaches at the University of Michigan. John and I meet every Friday morning at 7 o'clock religiously, and one day John says to me, Dan, no one leads alone. No one. He had nailed it. I couldn't talk to enough people, and I had students out all across the country interviewing people about what it's like to work in partnership. One of the most important interviews I had was with a guy that many of you may have heard. He's spoken on this stage. His name is Robert Reich. And I went to talk to Bob Reich, and I didn't ask him about economics and about inequality. I said, tell me about the guys you worked with and the women you've worked with. Tell me about your partnerships. And he did. He told me that he would never have gotten a minimum wage increase through the Congress had it not been for his deputy secretary of labor. He said to me, I'm an economist. I was a professor. I didn't know anything about Capitol Hill. He knew where all the bodies were buried. Then he told me about a guy who comes up to him. This is him. Jacob comes up to him, Jacob Kornbluth, and says, good books, you need to do a documentary. Reich says to Kornbluth, what do I know about documentaries? Kornbluth says to Reich, nothing, but I do. And together they do Inequality for All. Actually, Kornbluth was the leader in a literal sense. He was out in front. And then Bob Reich tells me about his publisher, or his editor. 14 books Reich has produced by this point, I think 20 by now. Same editor for every single book. Bob Reich told me in conclusion this. He said, those 3 people didn't make me twice as effective. He said, they made me 3 times more effective. And I hope I did the same for them. And that's when I got it. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's a multiplier effect. I get better. My partner gets better. Those around us and our strategy all gets better. So we did the research because we had to look at it. We did hundreds of interviews, as I've suggested to you. But we also went out and did survey work. So we'd ask people, as I could ask you in this room, think about your most important work partner right now. Somebody whose work is interdependent with yours. And we asked them to rate them from extremely difficult to average, poor, average, good, exceptional, and best ever. And we found extraordinary results when we pulled apart the research. The better the relationship, the better the results. Look at the scale of trust involved, 4.96 on a 5 scale. Working with my colleague makes me more effective. And perhaps the most important multiplier effect, their teams work better when they work better together. You can see that in marriages, you can see that in families, you can see that in business. So people ask me, are you suggesting that we always lead together? And I'm saying yes, but don't worry about the title. Worry about the practice. And we found 3 things in our research. Number 1, communicate openly and frequently. We found that our great partners were open on an intellectual level, so any facts, any ideas, any crazy conceptions, any pushback was allowed. And on an emotional, social level, that in the great partnerships, one might say to the other, dude, I've been in 3 weekends in a row. I need some help here. Are you with me? Or might say, hey, I'm sorry, but I think I got over my skis a little because I told our funders this, and I know you and I haven't hashed it all out. In other words, they don't go home to their spouse or their friends or their coach and say, you won't believe what he did this time. It's all brought into the relationship. Secondly, they share vision and values. I think of it as a third party in the partnership. There's one person, the other person, and then triangulating is the vision and the values. Where are we going and how do we want to get there? Contrast that with bad partnerships when this isn't the decision point, vision and values. In those relationships, it's how is this going to affect my power? How is this going to affect my control, my title, my money? Now, in the great partnerships, there's always the vision and values and a lot of discussion around that. And finally, they act with loyalty. They have each other's backs. They take care of each other. My favorite example of this is Hewlett and Packard. We now know the company is HP, but it was started in the proverbial garage in Stanford, California. But when Bill Hewlett got drafted into the Army, David Packard reduced his salary to the same level as Packard was getting paid. That's the kind of loyalty that we're talking about. Sometimes these are co-equals. Sometimes it's a vertical relationship, a CEO to a COO, a director to an assistant director. The title doesn't matter. What matters is the radical equality, the communication and respect, having vision, and being loyal to each other. Here's a great example of both our misconception and the truth of the matter. The misconception is a photograph from my bedroom. Can you see it? The Salesforce Tower, Olympian Heights, Mark Benioff at the top, leading the world, not just Silicon Valley. But the truth is he led with Keith Block for many, many years as COO. And last fall, this is what he said. He said, we've exchanged our vows and now we're co-CEOs, leading together. If you want to know how to do it, go out those doors in the back, turn left on Sproul Plaza, go about 400 yards, and go into the chancellor's office and say, can I please have an organization chart at the University of California, Berkeley? You don't have to do that because I brought it, right? Okay, so here's the org chart. There's the top. Chancellor Carol Christ, Executive Vice Chancellor Paul Alivisatos. Carol told my students in class, he's an engineer and an entrepreneur. I'm a literature professor and a longtime dean and president of universities. Our conversations are so rich. It's so rich, the biodiversity between the two of us. And when we walk out the door, she told me, you can't put air between us. We're that tight. What Paul says could be me saying. What I say could be Paul. So what I would suggest to you is that if you want to practice leadership, don't look for a position, look for a partner. It took my partner, John, to tell me that with my wife, I had been leading by 2. John told me, you're right there with her. And it was only through John I realized that I did what leaders do. I inspired her sometimes and said, Jen, you can do more, you can do better. Sometimes I challenged her, spoke truth to power when I thought maybe nobody else is telling her. And oftentimes I encouraged her. Ours was a love story. I no longer think of my wife as the great leader and me here. I think of us leading together, made for each other. And I would suggest to you that that is who we are as human beings. We're made for each other. If you want to practice leadership, go ahead and find a position. But I would say, look for a partner. Find somebody you can make better. Find somebody who makes you better. They have ideas, they have a style, they have contacts that can deeply enrich your work and cover over some of your rough spots. It may well be that the best work you do in leadership is the work I did, not my own accomplishment, but leading with a great partner. If you want to practice great partnership, find a partner and lead by two.